So today what I want to do, if you're up to it, is I want to talk about the motivation of your buyer. It's really related to the motivation of an individual, particularly in business, but really about the motivation of the buyer.
Okay.
So what does that mean? And how do you relate to it as a salesperson? How do you relate as a sales company? And it's interesting because the reason I want to talk about this is because often we want to sell a product or a service to people who probably need what you're selling, but often we forget about what motivates them. We forget about what it is that they're doing in their reality that makes it such that they would need your products, right?
Yeah.
Salespeople often forget because we get so focused on what we're selling,
Yeah.
And think of it, when you have sales objectives, you're telling people, okay, go out there, make so many cold calls, have so many meetings, make sure you're pitching your product, make sure that people are hearing about what we're doing and push and do everything you can to get them to buy, right? And it's not that that doesn't work, because we know it works, but I'm not sure it's the best way to get someone to buy.
Right.
And I guess, if what I've noticed in the last year, that is that last 2 years, last 3 years, last 5 years, my whole career, is that when you connect with someone, it's a lot easier to understand what they're all about, which is really what being positive is about, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. What do you think about that? What's been your experience with it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm more young in my sales journey than you are, and so that it's your instinct isn't always to quote unquote go there, right? Like you kind of go and we've talked about this here and there, where it's like your instinct is kind of go to what you're selling and kind of convince them that what you're selling is important and this and that. And usually there's a good nod of the head. Yes, it is important. You're right. Like improving sales results or marketing results is important. Like, yes, having a better system in place is important. Yeah. And like, unless you're like, like lying, like what you're saying makes sense to somebody. Right. But there's definitely that lack of connection that's there. So you kind of stay on that logical level or a logical plane where, it makes sense, but there's just no real reason to do it. You know what I mean? And I find like I've worked with a lot of salespeople over the years, and that need connection kind of happens almost serendipitously. Like, okay, well, they happen to have that need and they happen to understand that you can fix their need. And so then the sale happens, but the salesperson kind of just sticks on that logical level. So if there's a way of like helping understand or figuring out what that solution is, or even helping the prospect out understand what their true motivation is, then there's a big chance of closing. I've definitely seen that. But it's definitely a skill.
Well, it's fun to say that it's a skill, but it's also something that I think that's easily learnable. I remember when I started in sales in 1990. Yes, I'm old. I remember I used to use this thing called the 7 steps of the sales, and it was something that Xerox had developed. And you introduce yourself, you talk about the company a little bit, and then you ask the customer questions. And I remember one of my bosses saying back then, I didn't know much about sales. He says, when you sit in the office, he says, look around, because you'd be in people's offices back then. You'd be in the decision makers' office, the boss's office, because it was back then I was dealing with pretty small companies in size, not necessarily in volume. And said, look around at the pictures, look around at what you see the person's interested in, and ask questions about that. So it was a basic version of what I'm telling you, the motivation to buy, because what I would do is if I saw pictures of your children, I'd say, oh, your kids, where are they at school? And I was very good at starting those conversations. So what I would do is I build a rapport, right? but rapport. But what I didn't do is find their motivation to buy back then. And then I'd say, oh, I'd build a
Right.
rapport. Then I'd talk about, back then was telecommunications, long distance services. I'd talk about how we could save a ton of money, and then sometimes I'd sell. But what I didn't realize then is if I'd ask more questions and I'd ask them about what's important in their business, I asked them what their goals were. And sometimes you can find like the real motivation. Like some people's motivation is to retire. Some people's motivation is to hand the business down to their kids. And when you find that motivation, if your services or product can in any way connect to that person's achieving those goals, you've got to make it. If you're saving, back then when I was selling long distance services, I remember some companies used to spend up to $10,000 a month in the long distance fees. I know it's hard to believe, and we could go in there and we could save them, like it would cost them half that. That was a big chunk of money. So that's probably the equivalent of 20 today, and you're saving in big amounts. So you were helping them achieve their goals. Maybe opening another office, maybe having a different way of doing business. But it definitely, if you could connect with them. Now, I sometimes did, and it would make sense, but I had a hard time if someone had made that connection for me back then. So look, understand what they're trying to achieve, and how does your solution help them achieve that?
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, well, how do you do that? Well, some people are a little clunky at it. When I start teaching them how to do that, how to ask open-ended questions, they'll ask questions that are a little too abrupt. But how you do that is you start talking a little bit about what's important while you're there, and then you softly go towards what's important to them. If I ask you, and I did this just last week with a client, I'll do it with you right now. If I ask you an open-ended question, I say, if I ask you 5 closed-ended questions and I say, Fab, why did you buy in your neighborhood? Fab, did you choose Pointe Claire because it's a suburb, right? That's a closed-ended question. Then you'd say, yes.
Yeah.
But if I say to you, Fab, why did you choose Pointe Claire?
Yeah.
Can
and then you go into why, like, you like the neighborhood, you like the house.
Why did you choose Montreal? So the person would say, yeah, I chose Montreal because, and like, make it up. Let's do it right now. Let's do a fun role play.
Oh, well, it's a fun city. It's not too big, not too small. A lot of cultural things to do. I think it's a good place to raise kids eventually, and a lot of different things. It's very multicultural, so a lot of different experiences as well. Like I said, it's small enough that it still feels personal.
So, as a real estate broker, let's say I'm asking you this question, I'm finding out a ton of important stuff about you, right? I'm saying, okay, big, not too small, it's cultural, a good place to raise kids. I know you probably want to raise kids. And then if I'm smart, my next open question will be based on something you told me, right? I might ask you something entirely different, like, tell me why you chose to live close to the airport, but it's not at all related to what you just said. So, like, it's an open-ended question, but it doesn't really make sense. But if I say, tell me a little bit more about why it's important to you to be in a culturally rich city, then you might say, oh, I love different cultural, I like to taste different kinds of foods. I like to experience different culture. I don't like, homogenous societies. I come from a city, everyone's the same, whatever it may be. But you're going to find out about the person. And then eventually that real estate person is going to find out, okay, what's this person really looking for? Why are they looking to find these things? So, and it's interesting because when I start working with people who sell certain specific products and services, they often get caught in that loop of just sticking close to the product. And, and it's hard. So what I do with them is I do role plays that bring them in totally different worlds, right? So I pretend they're selling something else, and then sometimes they click, and then that's where you get there.
And so, I'm assuming the answer is it depends, but when you're kind of, because I like that idea of like, or that advice of like kind of building your open-ended questions on what they've said as opposed to what you feel makes sense, because what you feel makes sense is probably sticking around your product, your core product, and the functions and the features and the value that you say it brings. But when you say building off what the client says, like, what if you're talking to them and you're noticing you're kind of going somewhere that you feel brings you nowhere, right? Like, let's say we talk, you're an agent and you talk about the multicultural and then this, and then why is the multicultural of all that. And you just kind of feel you're somewhere that you're like, I don't know what to do with this anymore. Should you kind of continue and hope that it goes someplace, or should you just try to then shift the conversation, even though they, on a topic that they haven't brought up?
I think that's a very, very valid point. And when you start doing open-ended questions, you can go down the rabbit hole. And that's why you do role plays to practice them. But let's say the person's just going down multiculturalism and they start talking about the time they went to Italy and they're all excited. Remember, they're all excited. And that 2-3 minutes of your time when you're letting them go off in that world is probably doing them a world of good. And what are you doing? You're connecting to their passion, right? So then what you can come back, say, let's say you are a real estate broker, you can maybe close it off a little bit to bring it back on track and say something to the effect of, so I assume from what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you might want something close to an Italian neighborhood in Montreal, right? Then the person will laugh, say, ha, ha, ha. Then you'll bring it back. And then there's probably a few things that they said. And say,
right. So you could just
jump
to something else. So you could even say, going back to your airport example, kind of like, oh, does that mean you like to travel as well? And then like kind of go to this, this house is close to the airport and it's easy to get to. And so you can kind of hop into something.
Correct. Else. So if you see it's going on a crazy tangent, right? So you can try to focus on something else they mention, because you also mentioned, kids, neighborhood. So then you might say, you also told me school was important. Tell me more about that. Like, how's important for you to be? How important is it for you to be near a school? So if you have a few cues in what they said to you, and once they go off on a tangent, you can come back to those cues. Good, but let them talk, right? That's important too, because a lot of people think, okay, I've got a half an hour for this call. I got to only talk about what's business.
Yeah.
How's the other person going to feel like? Do they feel like they're connecting with you a little bit? You ask them an open-ended question. They can assume you're sincere, but in your head, you're just thinking, I want to sell my product. I want to sell my product. They're going to catch on to that. If you have that attitude, you have to, one thing you do is you have to cultivate a true interest in understanding the person. That's where you need to have empathy. You need to have empathy for the person's desire to reach their business goals. If you don't have that empathy, it's not going to work. If you're zero empathetic and your desire is only to sell something, you might sell that something, but you won't develop the kind of relationship where the person's going to respect you, because they're just going to feel like you sold them something. Now, you do want to build respect on expertise by asking the right questions, but you also want that person to know that you understand their reality. My best customers are the ones a few times have said to me, hey, I wish you could come work for me, because they know that I understand. And I also have a desire to make their business good.
Yeah.
You've had that. How many? I know people have tried to hire you 1,000 times. I know that you say, no, I work for myself. But you know that someone respects you when they want to try to hire you, because you say, okay, I like this. I want more of it. You come on board, you get what we're doing. But if you get that question, Fab, it's because you've understood their motivation. If Fab gets me, I want them in my, I want them in my building.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. And I mean, that is a good indication. I think, but if I go back to a few things that you said, I think I remember the episode that we did on managing emotions, and I don't remember exactly how we called it, but you mentioned like a trick to manage your emotions is to kind of write down things so that you're not constantly thinking about them, and kind of cutting conversations short. So I think this is a good place where that fits in, right? So as a person is writing down, telling you kind of what's important to them, you can write down the 4 or 5 things, and then just kind of, so you're not constantly trying to remember, okay, he said kids, he said traveling, he said this, and you're not really paying attention to what they're saying. So I think that fits in well there.
That's a really good point, because if you, not only will it help you stay focused, but it'll help you stay focused in the moment rather than trying to focus on the things that are important.
Yeah, and I think like, writing notes, I think is always nice when you're the not the salesperson, but the prospect, I guess, to see that your salesperson is taking notes on the conversation is a nice little value add. So I think, salespeople are like, oh, I can't take notes while I'm talking to somebody. I think for the prospect, it feels nice. Like it feels like you said something that's worth writing down. I think that's a really interesting little tidbit that I've experienced being the prospect and not the client, not the salesperson.
Yeah, there's I don't know about you, but there's something very comforting about
Yeah.
someone who takes the time to really understand what it is that either you need, you want, you're trying to purchase, or you're trying to explain a problem to someone. You know, when I know that when I walk into Home Depot and I want to
Hmm.
build my deck and I know nothing about building decks, and one of the guys says, okay, and he takes notes, he's taking measurements. He says, okay, yeah, I've done this before. It feels like, okay, this guy's taking his time to understand me. And
Hmm.
right away, and we've said this before, the very fact that he's listening
Mm.
builds his status of an expert towards me, right? Because I'm saying, okay,
Yeah, you're right.
it's interesting how people listening to us have that effect on us more. So when you're trying to find that motivation, it's really about connecting with what's important to that person. Now, and the business motivation is very different for people at different levels. We've talked about this too, right? If you're talking to a VP in a huge corporation, they might just want a promotion. If you're
Yeah.
talking to the owner, usually it's a little easier to find their business motivation because an owner who
Mhm.
started the company. But if you're talking to someone down into like a huge corporation and you're middle management, it might be a little harder to find their real motivation because they just have a job to do with a bunch of tasks, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Nonetheless,
Yeah.
you have to relate to their reality.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's, yeah, it's important to treat everyone with respect. And I think that's where talking to the decision maker comes into play. Decision makers obviously are able to make decisions, but yeah, I think, and I think one of the dangers that some salespeople run into is like you kind of quote unquote know what their desire is. Like you kind of, you feel what their desire is. You feel, oh well, that guy wants to get promoted, or she wants a different job, or she wants to move companies, and so on and so forth. But the reality, you don't always. I mean, some themes probably come back or recur, but you don't always know. The reality is you don't always know what the person. You rarely know what the person actually wants.
Yeah, and you're right. You rarely know. And another thing that's important is that if you do this properly and you have true interest, those next questions will almost be natural. I said this to someone this week that I was working with. I said, look, remember when you were a kid and an adult asked you some questions about what you were doing? At first, you were a little uncomfortable, but if they asked you the right questions about what interested you, you'd be talking for hours and you wouldn't let go of that adult, right? Whether you say, okay, yeah, he's talking to me about my comic books, or is he just gonna be like Uncle John who just says, oh, which comic books you buying, and then ask some other unrelated silly question. But if he's asking about your comic books, which of the characters, oh, okay, tell me about the characters interest you the most. Oh, yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
what is it that you like? Oh, it's the stories and all. And then like all of a sudden this person's, I know it's happened to me a few times in my life, not in a sales situation, but just in a conversation where I'm all fired up about what I'm talking about because the person seems genuinely interested in what I have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I remember when I was a kid in my early 20s, it was often older people that really had interest and passion in what was going on. Wow, that's just great.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know this person from a hole in the wall, and they want to know why I want to do what I want to do, and they have like sparkles in their eyes, and they're excited about my prospects in life. I just thought, wow, that's great, that's fun. That's how you want to make your clients feel. You want to make them
Yeah.
feel as though, hey, what they're going to do is awesome, and you're going to try to help them get there. Not just I want to sell you something.
Mm.
And if you don't do it right, if you ask, you can be the best person asking open-ended questions. But if you have a list of open-ended questions that are not related to their answers, I'm sorry, but you're conducting an interrogation. Most people don't like to be part of an interrogation, you know? Uh,
Right.
Mr. Fab, tell us where you were on July 10th, 1878, and what happened, all of a sudden, you're like, oh, this feels like an interrogation. And there's a fine line. There's a fine line, and I've been thinking about this a lot. And the fine line is not the open-ended question. The fine line is the open-ended question related to what the person's interested.
Yeah.
But what you
And for
said,
the record, I wasn't born in July 78, just for
yeah.
the record.
What's important is you're right. If the person goes off on a deep tangent, which they most likely, we have that fear, but they most likely don't. I've let clients talk a few times. I remember thinking, this guy's talking for 5 minutes, but he came right back to the point.
Mm.
And often if you let someone talk long enough, if they're just going off on a tangent, they'll just fizzle out.
Yeah.
But often they have a point on your, okay, that's the point. And you get to know a little bit more about the person you talk to. You have to have a true interest in human beings too. Anyways,
Yeah.
I sound like
no, I mean, it's important. And I think, and maybe this is very sales specific and sales management specific, but you mentioned something at some point about, oh, I only have 30 minutes. I need to talk about this. And sometimes I feel that's where some of the management, not approaches, but some of the management boundaries that they put in place to ensure that sales reps do their activities is set, like number of call quotas, number of time on the phone and stuff like that. And have you seen that sometimes like these types of quotas kind of are counterproductive some way? Like if I'm a rep and I know I need to make 100 phone calls a day, and I'm like, okay, that means I can only spend 15 minutes on a call with anybody, that's kind of counterproductive in a way, because it's better to have that one rep spend 45 minutes and make less calls that day, but, potentially have a sale than 15 minutes and then maybe not make the sale.
I 100% agree with you. And I've had that happen to me. I've been in a situation where I've talked to people and you can tell that they're getting antsy to get off the phone. But I'll tell you, I find in the last 5-6 years that people are less like that than they used to be. Like now, when you call when you're calling back your bank or they call you, they don't rush to get you off the phone anymore. They'll say,
that's true.
Have we covered everything that's important to you? They don't say, okay, bye, like they used to do. And I think that makes a big difference. I think someone's woken up exactly to what you're saying. The smart people know that, because you're right. If you say with someone, look, we only have a half an hour for your one-on-one today, but they have a huge problem, you might have to call the person up and say, look, I got to take, an hour with this person. They have a huge issue with the client. We're going to try to fix this, and we need to do it. Mm-hmm. But good managers, good managers are people that have empathy for their team. Good managers are people that put their team before them. They're people who say, my team's success is my success.
Yeah.
A good manager will listen to try to help their team player get there. Now, the manager that and we've all had one of these in our lives, that is just in it to make his quota and he doesn't give a shit about anyone, you feel it right away. It's the same thing for a salesperson talking to a client.
It's true.
Unfortunately, it happens in parenting too. Some people just they don't pay attention to their kids, and then they wonder why their kids are acting up.
So this is a sales, marketing, and parenting podcast.
Well, I think it's just a human thing.
I'm kidding.
I know you're kidding, but really, sales is it's human interaction. Sales is psychology. It's taking the time to understand, the person you're trying to sell to. And why they really need it, right? You need to understand that.
Yeah. Awesome.
Do you have anything else to say about this?
Not really. I think you covered a lot. Or we covered a lot.
Okay, good.
Thanks. Awesome. Thanks, Paul.
All right. See everyone next week.